To begin with, ethnobotany, people and plants, and this is a field that studies, it's usually a combination of anthropology and botany combined. Of course, anthropology, the study of human cultural and biological diversity, and botany, the study of plants, plant morphology, and plant physiology. So if you're an anthropologist interested in plants, you're generally looking at their applications, their use potential, and how they are appropriated in meaningful and useful and in economically interesting ways by peoples across the world. And the Ozarks, it turns out, is a fabulous place for ethnobotanical research, as I started to discover back in the early 90s, or the mid-90s when I was a graduate student at the University of Missouri. Medical folklore is the study of health beliefs, including conceptions of illness, ideas of wellness, what may make you sick, what makes you well. We have interesting ideas that still persist about, say, running outside in the damp weather and bare feet. Although oftentimes these are not empirically true, they are rooted in some kernel of relevance that we tend to maintain today. But the folklorists of the world are interested in the oral traditions of healing, and as such you'll find that there's a lot of interpenetration between ethnobotany and medical folklore. And we'll look at the same time at the customary health-seeking practices of people. Does anyone recognize that plant in the background there? Yes, mullein. I can tell already we've got a room full of plant experts, which is good. That is mullein, and mullein is one of the most overlooked and widely used plants of the region that has mainly been used topically as a poultice or as a bandage, an antiseptic, and so forth. So yes, and then what you'll find is there's photographs of useful plants sort of peppered throughout the presentation today. I know it's probably no surprise that the Ozarks are the study region for this particular presentation, but the Ozarks, we realize now, are about 50,000 square miles total. The Ouachita Mountains, furthest to the south, are geologically much younger and have a different soil chemistry. They tend to be more acidic and support a sort of reduced biodiversity of plant growth. So we find that the Ouachitas are unique in many ways, but the people who reside there share so much of the cultural connectivity and identity with the Ozarks that they've been included in the study. And I'll show you some of the differences in plant knowledge as it exists in the Ouachitas, which is reduced somewhat, which may be, which may reflect that biodiversity difference. So, people, plants, and medicine. People are oftentimes surprised to realize that about half of all the medicines in our medicine chests come from the plant world. You can go right to aspirin and think of willow bark. You can think of immediate foxglove, and digitalis, and all these important medicines that keep us well today originate in plants. And so, interestingly, about 70% of the world relies on folk medicine, which is informal knowledge and primary reliance on family, friends for guidance and social support. And so all of this speaks to, in many ways, biodiversity. And that is the efforts to safeguard the plant resources that comprise the ethnopharmacy, if you will, of people for whom plant-based medicines are vital to well-being and cultural continuity. The scholarly thrust of ethnobotany can be sort of condensed into at least three points. Ethnobotanists go deep into the past, and we call them paleoethnobotanists. And these are the archaeologists of the world who seek out the remnants of plants from ancient soil samples. You can take seeds and bits of nuts and corn cobs and charred grains and recover them from soils to discover what people were growing in the days of yore. We've used these data to find the points of origin of agriculture in the New World and in the Old World. And so we look to see where plant-based subsistence and medicine comes from and at what point in human history we see the emergence of agriculture. We also sort of work to model relations between people and plants. That is, how do we seek out plants? And what's funny to me is that plants often signal to the animal world, the browsers, the pollinators, and even to people, certain signs and cues that say, come, either pollinate me or pick me or consume me and so forth, and essentially to spread my seeds. The seed dispersal concept is part of the reproductive ecology of plants. And that's what leads even humans to discover and select plants, targeting our attention towards useful species and away from others. So we'll find that there are interesting perceptual and visible clues that oftentimes reveal when a plant may be useful. And so we also seek to conserve biodiversity and traditional plant knowledge in regional context. Biocultural diversity as the basis of folk wisdom. Just to give you a sense of the broad scope of ethnobotany, there's about 350,000 species of vascular plants. And basically that's everything except for mosses and ferns and some of the more primitive varieties. But if you look at the Arkansas plant base, it's fairly diverse. We have about 3,000 plant species documented, and I suspect there's upwards of 4,000, but 3,000 is what we at least know about for sure. And then I use the British Isles just as a comparison point because we also see a similar range of species documented there. Now, cultural knowledge conservation interrelates with the guardianship of ecological diversity. And does anyone know the most diverse forest or woodshed or watershed in the U.S. today in terms of where do you find the greatest abundance and distribution and variety of plants? In the Smoky Mountains, that's exactly right. I'm so glad that someone knew that. I really just discovered this. A friend of mine from Burnsville, North Carolina, called up to say, now I know you've got a lot of great plants in Arkansas, but just so you know, we've got about double what you've got. And so, I know it's humbling, but, it's true. We have to recognize that the geography of medicinal plant knowledge in many ways is related to the movement of people from places further afield and then into Appalachia and into the Ozarks, but we'll find similar contrasting use patterns. So we believe that cultural knowledge conservation interrelates meaningfully with the guardianship of ecological diversity. So knowing about plants and understanding and appreciating them leads to human efforts to conserve them. I was really interested when I got slightly involved in this project to document plant diversity and language distribution on a global level. And the reason I'm including this in the present lecture is to show you an interesting point. If you look at plant diversity, the darker the red shade, we find a higher richness of ecological plant availability. The dots you see are languages, human languages, and there are about 5,000, maybe 5,500 languages spoken on Earth. And what I find particularly interesting and relevant to this concept of biocultural diversity is the fact that in the places where ecological richness is apparent, we find greater cultural diversity. And there are many different explanations for this, but even if you look at Cherokee, for example, speakers and Caddo speakers in Oklahoma, and Comanche and so on, and if you look at where native languages are being maintained, you often find pockets of native plants that are often maintained as well by those people who cling to and resist modernization, who resist homogenization. So we know then that when you find a diversity of cultures coexisting in a region, you're more than likely to find a fairly diverse ecological landscape as well. And you'll see, I think, how this logically relates to the present research. What is the scope of the work? Well, I started this back in 1995 as a master's student, University of Missouri, hoping to discover something really interesting about the Ozark plant world and the folk medical practice that exists there. And I come from South Arkansas. I was born and raised in El Dorado, and the hill country always to me seemed so different and exotic and interesting and really sort of separated from what was familiar to me. We identified more with the piney woods of North Louisiana than we did with the upland country and culture and so forth. But I've now completed 61 interviews with residents across the area, and at the same time, I've been working very, very recently on sort of an addendum, an ancillary study in England and in Ireland to look for the origins of certain use patterns that we see in the Ozarks today. And this is because so many people who I've spoken with often reference the British Isles. And of course, we'll find too that the Cherokees have contributed substantially to this information base that we see in the Ozarks, and I'll discuss that as well. Okay, research methods. What I did in the present study is I used what we call a chain referral sample, which is essentially a snowball sample. When you locate a few experts in a community, say like Melbourne or Salem or in Kabul, Missouri, what you'll find is they will oftentimes recommend a friend or another friend who you then consult, and then work with, and then they in turn recommend others. So a network of plant experts begins to emerge. And in the Ozarks already, we've had 49 respondents who have provided information. 12 in the Ouachitas. They're a little harder to find in the Ouachitas because it seems to me that the communities are more fragmented and there's a little bit less sort of sharing and commingling of knowledge there. And in the British Isles, I've got two in Ireland and 2 in England. And I've used the successive free list technique, which I'll show you in a moment, collected voucher specimens and demographic data to begin to model portraits of how knowledge is conserved in different places in the region. These are rose hips, by the way. I'm going to try to bring as many examples to the presentation as I can. So what is it like to gather plants and record folk medical knowledge in the field? The Oklahoma Ozarks on the upper left are an interesting mosaic of peoples and cultures. You have, Euro-Americans, Cherokees, traditional Cherokees, all oftentimes living in the same place. This results in a really high elaboration of knowledge, and here we're preparing kanuchi, which is a traditional hickory nut soup that is revered in that region, gathering watercress here with the guidance of an expert. And here we're in the river cane break, learning about all the applications for river cane. But I thought in a presentation such as this, it might be nice to have a few visuals to see what the field work is like. Now, in a successive free list, what you'll generally do, collecting data, is you'll ask a willing respondent to just mention as many types of useful, edible, or medicinal plants that they can think of. And this was one of the very first ones I completed over in Cherokee Nation, where the respondent said, well, I've got to start with blackberry because this is the first and most interesting and the most, probably relevant one of all. And then, heel all. Then, wild strawberry. And then the list continues. So and then ginseng, which is really fairly rarely used now because it's very difficult to find. And also locals are pretty good about safeguarding their ginseng patches. This I'm not going to focus on too much, but it does have a history of use in the region. Though dwindling. Bloodroot, very Cherokee way, or very Cherokee plant-based medicine. Jewelweed, cedar. Of course, this is also juniper. Sometimes you have to cross-check to make sure that we're on the same page with the respondent in terms of species identification. Hickory, sassafras, mullein, and coneflower. Once you've elicited a list of plants, you then seek to find all of their uses, the part of the plant that's used, and the mode of ingestion. Now, one question that's interesting to me is that very oftentimes we find that the roots are the part of the plant that seem to provide the greatest concentration of biochemical or active alkaloids. What is it about the roots, you guys? What would you think it is about the roots that allows them to generate such antibiotic activity? Where do they reside? Obviously in the soils, and as such, they're more prone to have higher concentrations of alkaloids that serve to prevent hungry bacteria and so forth. So we find that if you look and think logically about plant morphology and ecophysiology, we begin to understand how and why certain parts of plants are used in particular ways. But this is just to provide a sense of how data are collected in the field when you conduct folk medical research in this way. Now I'd like to go through about 10 different really important and interesting and widely recognized Ozark plant foods and medicines. It's interesting. Persimmon, I was speaking with Olivia earlier about the possibility of late persimmons and making some persimmon bread or some persimmon pie and sharing it. And it turns out that they're just now gone. And I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with or are fans of the flavor of persimmon, but persimmons are terrifically interesting. They're loaded with vitamin C, for one thing, and a host of really complex secondary alkaloids that have been used for centuries by Native Americans. This is one of the particularly distinct native plants that I'd like to mention. They're prized not just for their flavor and their food applications, but for their syrup. This is true for elderberry. Lots of plants are known for their syrups that contain higher concentrations of all the good stuff that does wonders for the body. Now, syrup from the ripened fruits appears in the Ozark Ouachita and the Cherokee folk therapies. And the interesting thing that I keep finding is that it's for gastrointestinal distress, intestinal bleeding, and also revered in therapies for diarrhea, abdominal pains, and what are simply provided to me as women's complaints. Oftentimes in the field, when I collect data on the application for plants, women's complaints is a good, and I think potentially polite way of saying, say no, ask no more. Just trust us that this is a good. This has lots of use potential. So persimmons are interesting. The heartwood is a fantastic quality versus the pawpaw, which has a very little or reduced value in terms of its wood. But the persimmon tree is one that does best in stands and in colonies, and is fairly cosmopolitan in terms of its distribution across the southeast. Wildlife love to forage on them, from deer to bear to you name it, and of course people. So it's interesting how humans and animals are oftentimes browsing in competition for the same species, and that's for good reason. But don't get a hold of the really unripe persimmon unless you're ready to get puckered up. But the problem with persimmons, or I should say the benefit of persimmons, has yet to be fully recognized. But we do know that the natural products research jockeys in the world are very, very keen to learn more about what it is in persimmons that is doing such fabulous antioxidant work in terms of folk medical or health maintenance in general. So to continue on this line of inquiry, I have to mention now the blackberry. And blackberry is in the genus Rubus, which one of the best famous, most knowledgeable botanists I know, Johnny Gentry at the University of Arkansas, spent a large part of his career just devoted to the genus Rubus, which includes raspberries and dewberries and wineberries and all sorts of related berries. And these are fantastically interesting species, not only in terms of their growth habitat and their potential to grow in brambles, but at the same time because their roots do things that they interfere with bacterial replication. We have found in the last year with UAMS and their pharmacologists down there, they've asked me to gather as many of these sort of blackberry root concoctions and test them under biofilms to see what they do. They interfere particularly with staph infections, with the Staphylococcus bacteria. Prevents its matrix from forming, so if you're drinking a tea made of the root of blackberry, you're very likely to receive lots of nutritive medical benefits, particularly in the antibiotic way. But the interesting thing about blackberry is that while sometimes considered a weed, others call it black gold. It's got lots of applications. You can freeze these to combat nighttime coughs. The roots are also great for digestive pains. And most of these teas are made from leaves and sometimes the root. But this is interesting because it shows that these medicines that we've believed in and shared for centuries are often based on quite common species. You'll notice that the plants we mentioned today are not rare particularly. They're not infrequent particularly. They're often salient, obvious, perceptible, and available. And so I find this interesting that we often ignore or neglect the very species that are most ubiquitous around us. Moving forward, pawpaws. Pawpaws are actually gaining interest. There was a great presentation on NPR about 2 years ago on America's forgotten fruit, the pawpaw. It is indigenous to native North America, and all the way through the southeast and down further into Mexico. They're highly prized for their sweet and delicate flavor. I mentioned they have various names, custard apple, and so forth. And the flavor to me is a bit like combining a mango with a banana, perhaps. And at the same time, there's not a lot of medicinal value, except I did have one respondent say, high in fiber and good for intestinal distress. So I would say that pawpaw certainly exists more in terms of its nutritive and its flavor value as an additive to desserts, pies, puddings, cakes, ice creams, custards. There's a number of frozen whips. Missouri folk love pawpaws, and they also are really well known across further into the Appalachian region. So the wood, however, is very soft and of very little use value, but nonetheless, there's a lot of identity in pawpaw maintenance and even in pawpaw cultivation. About a month ago, my dad sent me a box of pawpaws from an orchard in Maryland, and they were about as big as basketballs, and I almost thought, is this an abomination? Pawpaws can't be that large. That's usually the size, they usually fit in the palm of your hand, but they are, they can be cultivated. They may lose a little bit of flavor, but at the same time, I think they're emblematic of this interesting, ongoing, evolving relationship that humans have with native and immigrant species that are around us all the time. Now, Pennyroyal, because it's in the title and because it starts with a P. I had to keep this relevant and salient in the presentation. Pennyroyal is an interesting mint. It's considered a weed by many, and while it wouldn't appear to be an especially relevant therapy or plant-based remedy, it actually is quite aromatic and has a complex chemical structure. It is a carminative, and that's a fancy schmancy word for a flatulence fighter. And I found it interesting that so many people on their list would mention pawpaw. People love, or I'm sorry, pennyroyal. They love pennyroyal, even though the flavor is distinct and a little bit somewhat bitter, sort of savory, but almost sort of too minty in essence. So it's often diluted or combined either with alcohol or with hot water, crushed, steeped to make a tea for immediate consumption. Pennyroyal has a lot of applications, and what's interesting is that no one agrees on its most relevant application. Instead, what people tell you is that it's one of the plants that has preventative health properties. So a pennyroyal tea is always a good idea. It's considered by some of my Native American respondents life medicine, which is a good way of saying, plants that sustain you, that help you fight infections, and that contribute to well-being in general. So the way that these are actually harvested is quite interesting and simple. Harvested fresh, they're hung upside down, usually air-dried on porches or in cool places, and then they're stored for later household use. I've got a little property south of, or near Winslow where I located recently a little root cellar, and I found some small mason jars buried down in there with what looks like pennyroyal, and I kept thinking, oh my gosh, I wonder if it was that, has it been, that relevant and that important over the years? And I think maybe it has. And that is not native. That is actually one that comes from, it's actually much more commonly used and known in Great Britain. And it's actually one of the more distinctly British immigrant plants. And it's considered a weed by some. But then again, so many of the mints in this study are immigrants. And so, and they occur in disturbed places. Interestingly enough, in a place where humans have either cultivated or where a garden was once planted and has been abandoned or left for fallow, you'll find that these opportunistic, chemically powerful weeds often appear. And so this relationship between weeds, human cultivation, and medical therapeutic applications is one that's very interesting. This speaks to biodiversity and human migration. Humans can and do, we often seem to place humans as the culprit or the instigators of biodiversity destruction. But what's interesting to me is that as humans move, as ethnic groups travel, for example, we generate biodiversity. We create habitats for new and opportunistic species to endure. And so as human groups migrate over landscapes and landforms, the bioactive species that we often rely upon, and especially in the past needed for health maintenance and well-being, proliferate through migrations. Now, catnip is one of the most interesting ones too. I was interested that it took a while. Catnip didn't come up in conversations with respondents until 2 or 3 follow-up sessions had been completed. It's as though catnip is something of a secret. People don't want to talk about it straight away because I think people understand that it's mainly a cat attractant. But if you look deeply into the biochemistry of catnip, it is, most of its bioactivity is attributed to naphthalactone, which is a complex and interesting and mild sedative. Cats love it, but humans, we don't quite have the same, we don't quite get the same jolt apparently from this particular species. But it is an anticonvulsant. It's an antitussive. It prevents cough, and it's a powerful cat attractant. But this is just a small example of all of its applications. And I'm interested, too, in the fact that catnip is another invasive species, and we tend to have really ambivalent feelings about invasive species. If it doesn't belong here, if it doesn't grow here, if it wasn't naturalized here. But what's interesting is that we're surrounded by a mosaic of immigrants and natives, and this is true in daily life and in terms of our relations with the plant world, too. But I couldn't resist a moment of a pause, a reverence for catnip and how greatly revered it is, especially in teas. The biogeography of Ozark medicinal plants, we can say with certainty by now that these plants exist in various habitats, and particularly in cultivated or abandoned fields or what we call disturbed lands that have been either cultivated or have been managed or mismanaged, but along forest edges, on the roadsides, where you see fence posts or even an abandoned homestead. along stream banks, in cottage gardens, growing in what they call, I've heard this term, chaotic and glorious messes. So oftentimes these are colonies that are semi-cultivated and somewhat tended, but definitely part of the cognitive map of the ethnopharmacy of the region. Chickweed is here presented on the right. It's another immigrant used throughout the Ozarks. It's got cooling and soothing properties applied topically for if you've got a burn or if you've got an abrasion or if you have an open wound. It's got lots of properties. It's antibiotic. It seems to reduce swelling. For ulcers, it's good, and it actually grows in a mat-like way, so it seems to almost indicate its sort of bandaging or healing or soothing properties just on the basis of its growth habit. So, and this gets precariously close to what medical historians call the doctrine of signatures, which is this notion that plants reveal what they are used for. For example, the blood red color of beets being a good treatment for anemia. That's an example of the doctrine of signatures. And while that's really, I think, more a function of how human minds respond to plants, it's also an interesting way of understanding the process of discovery, because oftentimes chickweed, for example, was discovered simply through trial and error. These plants are often known not because they're apparent, but because nothing else was available at a given time. Another example is goldenrod, and solidago is an interesting, this is the scientific name, various species exist. Goldenrod is an antiseptic. It's really popular. My Irish respondents and my Ozark respondents were quite enthusiastic about goldenrod, although it's a weed, and in other words, it's a wild, what they call a simple, it may be semi-cultivated and patches. The goldenrod seems to cluster together, but it's oftentimes associated with luck, prosperity, good fortune, and is revered in that way. They're safeguarded seasonally, and they're nurtured and tended by families over time in both the rural Ozarks and in the Ouachitas. I find it interesting that the range of applications for goldenrod goes from skin infections to fevers, to kidney pains, to backache and indigestion. And these are 5 different people giving me 5 different applications for a plant. What that tells me is that there's a lot of biochemistry going on in terms of goldenrod. And it's one of hundreds, if not thousands, of species that have yet to be investigated or applied meaningfully or medically. So if nothing else today, my hopes are to inspire some interest in the possible use potential of these otherwise overlooked species. Now, the folk food medicines. One of the things that I kept really getting intrigued by the further the research progressed was this continuum, this sort of gradation between what's edible and what's medicinal. And I think we have a notion that, with sort of bitter herbs will cure you, and that what's bitter or pungent or aromatic is possibly more powerful or efficacious or has greater healing potential. But these kitchen herbs or garden herbs and these culinary additives that are often, used with eggs, very traditional plant or dish in the spring is wild onions, green onions, and eggs, and Cherokee culture especially. But it's also common in the rural, Euro-American Ozarks. So the cultural connections between homegrown foods, flavors, and health-enhancing herbs is evident, and countless of the home therapies that have been documented. And you can find these in the spring, and they're a lot of fun and really tasty, and those are pretty sturdy examples of wild onion. And by the way, wild onions is a member of the Liliaceae, which includes garlic and lots of other, there's a blue onion, there's a whole host of other onion types that are out there, all of which have slightly different applications, but this is just an example of one. Now, the ecology of medicinal plant selection. So many of these secondary chemical compounds that are actually medicines are produced in species such as the asters. And the aster family, you can imagine what else it includes. Dandelion, for example, purple coneflower, tickweed, bachelor's buttons. There's a whole host of different examples. But these are species that are classified in the Asteraceae, or the sunflower family. And ecologically, these are plants that have high proportions of therapeutic compounds. And why would a plant produce an expensive, complex compound? Well, it's quite obvious, I think, from an ecological point of view, that this is nature's defense against hungry browsers. It's a great way for plants to discourage herbivory or ingestion by other, by other humans and animals. So they provide chemical protection against hungry browsers, but for humans, these are, in fact, medicines. So the oxeye daisy is a good example. It's not quite as commonly mentioned, but those who know it abide by it. It's used for various, again, women's complaints, also known for its antispasmodic properties. So it seems to prevent cramps and abdominal pain. It's a diuretic, and it has a similar taste to chamomile, which is also related. Now, these are produce leaves that are eaten fresh in salads or brewed, and it's the same thing applies for dandelion, the close cousin of the oxeye daisy. So most of the members of this family have lots of different applications, and this is true across the North America, in different native societies in general. So whenever you see a member of this family, look into it and investigate its potential use appeal. Another example here, comfrey, symphytum, to make whole. If you look closely at the scientific names of these plants, we oftentimes are privy to ancient knowledge of their use. This is a plant that has an interesting taproot, goes straight down into the soil, and when scraped, with a blunt object, you get sort of a milky substance that's applied topically to ease pain from fractures and bruises and sprains. Comfrey does not pop out of the wall of green when you're in the woods searching for it, but it does seem to have a number of interesting use applications. About 52% of all the plants that I've gathered in the study are known and used throughout rural England, Scotland, and the Isle of Man, which reveals how people, plants, and medical knowledge spread over time and space. I was so surprised by this high proportion of non-native species, but again, I thought that really spoke to this intermingling of human knowledge and migration. I believe that these were brought over deliberately or non-deliberately, but did find their way, whether by accident or whether purposefully, from there to here. And this is an interesting concept, and there's several different books that have been written. There's a great book called The Ethnopharmacy of Human Migrations, Traveling Peoples and Plants, that really discusses this phenomenon. And this is something we don't recognize often, just how closely aligned plant movements are with the migration of ethnic groups over time and space. And so again, this cultural connectivity between the Ozarks and places further into Europe are evident when you look closely at the plants that are used. Now this is one that I had to include, elder. The elder tree has a deep, dark, folkloric sort of origin. It was feared and revered and respected greatly. The idea was that if you cut an elder tree in that days of yore in ancient Britain or Scotland, you could be cursed or could be doomed. And I wonder if that's not a sort of a reminder of the cultural potential and use appeal of this particular tree. Elderberry is used in all sorts of things. It's a great dye for Cherokees. It's got all these other properties. It's good for painkiller. It's a laxative. The berries are really considered the best for toothache. And the roots are rubbed on warts. And what I kept finding interesting is that people still believe in different ways. Warts are oftentimes difficult to cure, so drawing even the hand on a piece of paper and then burning the paper, there's a little bit of sympathetic magic. There's hints of archaic residual beliefs that still permeate the Ozark folk cultural landscape. But these common trees are cherished and steeped in lore. Elderberry tea is well known as a treatment and maybe among the most popular. At the Ozark Natural Foods, you can find elderberry tea, and it does seem to be quite popular, and I think it's got lots of unknown applications, particularly for respiratory distress and infections. I'm fairly convinced that it's loaded with complex antibiotics that we have yet to really understand thoroughly. Now, the roots of Ozark medicines, I mentioned earlier that in the root structure of plants, we find a lot of potential. So the roots of common species such as burdock and dandelion target respiratory, circulatory, digestive disorders. These photos came from Britain, but I found that my respondents in southern Missouri were very keen to affirm or confirm that these two together are better than alone. Burdock and dandelion apparently have some sort of a synergistic effect on the body when taken together. And it's a preventative health tonic, it's sort of a stimulant, a little bit of a panacea for all that may ail you. And it's still popular, and you can even buy this beer in rural England as part of the culinary tourism landscape that's emerging there. So soft drinks and beers in the customary English style are very close to those that you find today in the Ozarks. one of the things I need to make very clear, you guys, is that when we think of weeds, we often think of problematic species, those that are, that need to be eradicated. But what's interesting is that they are actually some of the most ecologically and evolutionarily savvy species out there. Full of secondary alkaloids, full of antimicrobial agents, lots of tannins and phenols all occur in higher percentages in these invasive species. The ones that grow fast, the ones that you can't stay on top of, are often that way simply because they're designed to grow fast, to replicate quickly, and to do so before humans or other animal browsers can interfere. Sumac is an example. Pokeweed is an example. Blackberries also fit. And so these chemicals are considered by medical ecologists as defense compounds because they protect against hungry browsers. A few other quick examples, the Asteraceae, this sunflower family I mentioned earlier. Tick seed is another life medicine and a preventative medicine. Coneflower, of course, is great for colds, coughs, congestions, and overall health. The healing mints of the Ozarks are vast. I mean, so many of the plants reported are mints. And mints, of course, we know not only for their flavor and their aromatic properties, but they tend to be very antibiotic in character. So heal-all, which is actually very British in origin, is now considered one of the most prominent and useful Ozark species for a variety of health concerns. Lemon balm is another good example. Now, the medicinal spring greens include wild garlic, allium on the left, watercress, delicious, and in Cherokee, the word for watercress is interesting. It translates to green fire on the water, which is interesting because it sort of has a flame-like appearance, but it's also spicy. And so when people tell you about the name, they'll explain that, it speaks to the flavor and to the occurrence and the appearance and the morphology. So there's much to be said in understanding nomenclature. And plants are often named because they're known. Others are known because they're named. But in this case, I should mention that the medicinal berries of the Ozarks are highly relevant to folk health maintenance. The dewberry on the left, the low-growing, earlier fruiting variety, is possibly the most bioactive in terms of its root structure. It's loaded with all sorts of good chemicals that prevent damaging microbes from doing their dirty work. The wild strawberry on the right is interesting too because it was a sedative. It's considered a sedative here in the U.S., but it's an antibiotic if you look further into Ireland and to Scotland. So regardless, we can find that the different peoples at different times have located various applications. I wanted to quickly, before we go, to mention that there's one program I've been using to understand this relationship between plant knowledge across the region. So I used a program called ANTHROPAC. It's a really primitive program that looks at cultural knowledge data, and then it examines the size of the domain, how much people know, who knows what, and how these knowledge bases relate to one another. So I was able to discover how and why demographics matter. So to give you an example, in the eastern Ozarks on the left, we find that pennyroyal and catnip and slippery elm were really, really commonly mentioned. And in the western Cherokee group, we had wild onions, kochani, which is green coneflower, huckleberry and sassafras and possum grapes. Less medicine, more food for the Cherokees, but the Ouachitas were so interesting to me because sassafras was the most commonly mentioned. And sassafras is not what we often consider a really economically relevant species, but the roots taste like root beer and do have it's a laxative, it's also a carcinogenic, so it's a problematic plant. But pine is another, pawpaw, of course, sumac, snakeroot, blackberry, walnut, and going down. More common, less diversity, but still you see this human predilection to identify useful species. Witch hazel, I found that interesting too. But look at the ginseng over there, and not that commonly used anymore. I think it's on maybe a little bit less popular than that once was. So there was a crude root drug trade market that was vibrant in the 50s and 60s. And during that time, snake root, ginseng, all sorts of other root crops were brought to the distributors in St. Louis. And there's still a little stream of it, but for those folks were a little bit less, they were a little more reluctant to talk to me. I only had 2 root diggers in my group that were able to, that said, oh, sure, I'll talk to some anthropologist about what I know. And it worked out all right. So this looks fancy, but it's really not. It's just a way to graph agreement. But so, for example, if Alan mentioned pennyroyal, pawpaw, catnip, and then let's say I mentioned pennyroyal, pawpaw, and persimmon, we would be very close because our lists were 66%, overlapping. But if you have nothing in common, if your lists are completely different, this program iterates every possible combination so that symbols far apart represent informants or respondents whose knowledge was very different from one another. The ones in the center are the most modal or representative of the group. So these two individuals close to the intersection of the axes were really the most representative or the most modal and most typical. And so interestingly, you see a geography of knowledge at work, whereby the Ozark people tend to know naturally, as you may expect, more about certain plants. And then, of course, the Washitas have their own sort of system. The British Isles in the middle interested me so much because my 4 respondents from Ireland and England seemed to have knowledge that connected different regions. And I thought, how interesting, because this is sort of a source area for some, but not all knowledge. Now, what this does is it gives you a way of understanding distribution, but what's also interesting is to map how age matters in terms of knowledge. I took the definitive or the independent variable here, the dependent variable, I should say, number of plant applications. So again, if Billy Joe Tatum, who was 90 years old, was able to give me 35 different plants, or applications, then I would map it as such. We found that the older you are, it's not so much that you know more plants, but you know more ways to use the plants. So it tells you that there's a pattern of knowledge elaboration that seems to occur with socialization, experience, and age and wisdom. And while that's not a really terrifically powerful correlation, it is significant, and it does show what you may expect to be self-evident. Now, in the Voices of Hill Country Healers, I had to record a few of the most, I think, poignant moments that I documented. I had a particular respondent tell me that for years she just studied plants without using them. She would say that some need to be established, like the cleavers, but others, like mullein and elder, she felt comfortable using straight away, believing they would replenish themselves, and they have. The reason I included this quote is because I think it signalizes this intricate, sensitive, and I think really deeply rooted, thoughtful conception and appreciation for the ecology of plants, for their reproductive habits, and for their use potential. So I think this is a sort of telling of the level of stewardship that keeps folk medical knowledge alive. Almost finished up, you guys, but I had to show you all this. This is an interesting graph that shows you the categories of applications found throughout the region so far. People mainly go to the plant world for foods, and of course many of these foods are medicinal. Mayapple's more of a medicine or a tonic. Colds and coughs, of course, we have so many examples: sedatives, laxatives. Insect repellents, Osage orange is a great example. There's lots, or the bodark, another good example. Fever reducers, wounds, burns. These, you guys, if you look at the applications for Ozark medicinal plants, this is a body of knowledge that has been maintained to sustain health, not necessarily to treat or to diagnose, but to ensure well-being and to aid symptoms as they occur. They're also indicative of the problems of an aging population, but that's quite typical in medical folklore studies in rural communities where the knowledge of the elders is the most relevant and available. Now, in summary, I want to mention that plants' health and survival, we can say with definitive, confidence that folk medicine in the Ozarks signalizes a unique process of biocultural adaptation. So it's not frozen, it's not static, it doesn't just remain in place. Instead, it's modified and revised. And today, with the internet and with information sharing and social media, we're no longer seeing the Ozarks as this sort of backcountry repository where knowledge is encapsulated. Instead, it's much more, I think, generative than that. Evolutionary ecology suggests that healing alkaloids, that is, therapeutic chemicals, evolved purposefully, sometimes as toxins to discourage hungry browsers, but oftentimes what's toxic is medicinal, as we all know, and as such we have a challenge to ascertain that distinction between what is toxic and what deleterious and versus what's therapeutic and healing. But there are families such as the mints and the asters, and the rose family and its berry producing members that have lots of use potential. And then the final slide I have is that plants' human health and survival, I think, are critical for cultural growth and discovery. Diverse colonies of wild flora are essential as nutritive medicines in the rural U.S. and also across the world. And, you consider that's a lot of people, 70% of the world relying on traditional medicine, and here we have in our own backyards good evidence of that. And I do believe that understanding human knowledge, behavior, and patterns of plant use and biogeography and migration all can collectively contribute substantially to the ongoing biodiversity conservation efforts, which will hopefully stand to benefit not just today's generations, but those yet to follow.